7 November, go.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. In my presentation, really what I want to do is just to share briefly with you some of Durban's experiences as an African city addressing the challenges of climate change. But firstly, just for those of you who may not know much about Durban, we are the third largest city in South Africa. Durban is the largest port city on the east coast of Africa, and for South Africa is a really important logistics centre and also an important tourism destination. But Durban is also an African city, and so it is characterised by very high levels of poverty and unemployment. And many of the people in our city lack access to many basic services such as housing, sanitation, and water. And the problem with climate change is that it's likely to exacerbate all of that and to make it a lot worse. Durban, under future climate scenarios, is expected to have higher average temperatures that are likely to result not only in sea level rise, but also in far less predictable rainfall. So we're expecting to experience much heavier periods of rainfall and flooding at times, but at the other extreme to experience more periods of drought. And the potential impacts of those kinds of changes on a population that is already vulnerable, the impacts on things like health, on food security, on homes and infrastructure, is likely to be devastating. And so how has this context of a growing city, but also one that is already quite vulnerable, how has that context influenced the way in which Durban is responding to climate change? And I'd like to just share with you briefly 3 approaches that Durban has adopted in dealing with this challenge. The first, we've really tried to understand the context of our city and to develop locally appropriate climate change responses. And for Durban, what that's meant is that we've prioritized climate change adaptation, acknowledging that while mitigation does make a lot of sense, and obviously it's important, and Durban does implement a number of projects looking at things like energy efficiency and alternative energy, for cities that are already vulnerable, adaptation is a far more immediate priority. And ironically, the day before Durban hosted COP17, the international climate change negotiations at the end of last year, the city was hit by heavy rain. And those newspaper headlines just give you some indication of the loss of life, the loss of infrastructure that happened with just one heavy rainfall event. And for us, it was a really sobering reminder ahead of those negotiations, really of the vulnerability of many populations globally. But indeed, much of the world and much of the negotiations themselves are still fairly heavily mitigation focused. And what that's meant for Durban is that the city, in taking quite a strong adaptation stance, has needed to become a champion, a global champion for adaptation. And there are a number of other cities, some already mentioned, which are adopting adaptation, but there are many that are not, and that are not regarding it as important. And so that champion role has become quite important for us. During COP17, Durban hosted the Durban Local Government Convention, and a key output of that was something called the Durban Adaptation Charter. And that was signed by mayors and elected officials, collectively representing more than 900 local governments worldwide. And that for us really just was a strong sign of the growing importance with which adaptation is being viewed, but also of the role that cities are prepared to play in taking the lead in developing adaptation responses. The Charter itself is fairly broad and fairly generic, But it's really a starting point, some starting principles that were agreed on by those present as some of the principles that cities should be considering when developing climate adaptation responses. And the Charter covers principles such as the importance of including and mainstreaming adaptation into all city planning, looking at the needs of vulnerable communities when planning adaptation, prioritizing the role of functioning ecosystems, finding ways to secure funding, ways to monitor and evaluate, forming partnerships and so on, just to give you a couple of examples. The second approach that Durban has adopted is really to try and keep the learning opportunities as broad as possible within this sphere of climate change adaptation. Because adaptation is not easy to understand, it's not easy to define, it means something different depending on which city you're in, and it's also very difficult to monitor and assess whether you, through whatever interventions you're putting in place, whether you are actually moving towards a stronger position of adaptation. And so what we've tried to do is to really test, to implement projects, to see what works, what doesn't, and through that process to broaden our understanding of what adaptation means for our city. And I'd like to just quickly give you a few examples. As an environmental department, we've worked very closely with some of our key municipal sectors, disaster management, health, and water, just as a starting point, and really worked alongside them to help them to understand the impacts of climate change in the future and what that will mean in terms of their own sectors and what they need to be building into their own planning to make sure that they are equipped to deal with what is coming. We've also worked closely with businesses and NGOs to implement a number of projects which focus on what we call community ecosystem-based adaptation. And really what these projects do is to employ local communities, people who are unemployed, to undertake ecosystem restoration work, normally in some of our, mostly in our important river catchment areas, which is our source of water. And that restoration work can be anything from invasive alien plant clearing to reforestation to wetland rehabilitation and so on. We've also tested out things like decision-making tools. We tried to develop what we called an integrated assessment tool to try and help our decision makers to understand the impacts of climate change, but also to incorporate that into their own decision making. And we've looked at things like community adaptation and food security. So in Durban, where much of the rural population is predominantly dependent on one staple food crop, which is maize, what does a future with higher temperatures mean for that crop? And will it be able to survive under those conditions? So we've done a lot of tests around that. We've explored alternative food crops. And importantly, we've also tested the acceptability of those alternatives to the people who will need to eat them. Because often there are cultural reasons why people choose to focus on one crop only. So a whole lot of issues around food security as well. And we've also piloted projects like green roofs. This one is on our municipal building. And we've really used that as an opportunity to explore how green roofs can help to regulate temperatures in buildings, how they can be used to regulate stormwater runoff, which for us is a big concern going forward, and obviously increasing biodiversity in the city. And we've developed protocols around those to guide future green roof development in the city. And what's been important about all of these projects is that they've been important learning opportunities. And I'd like to just highlight some of the learnings from these. Our municipal adaptation plan work taught us that while ultimately we might be wanting to move towards a situation where we have one integrated climate adaptation plan for the city, initially for us it was important to work directly with individual sectors, to build capacity, to build understanding, and that in the end actually helped to ensure integration at a broader level. Our community ecosystem-based adaptation work has shown us the benefits of finding projects that achieve a range of benefits. In these cases, not only climate adaptation, but also the restoration of ecosystems and jobs and employment for people. But what we're starting to realize is that one of the big challenges with these projects is ensuring their sustainability. How do you ensure sustainability of projects like this where people are dependent now for their livelihoods? And there's only so much ecosystem restoration work that one can actually do in a developing city. Our integrated assessment tool, the decision-making tool we experimented with, was an absolute disaster. The final product couldn't be used by our decision makers, and it couldn't be used by scientists. It sat somewhere in an awkward middle and wasn't any good to anyone. But what that experience taught us was that it's actually very difficult to develop these neat tools to box climate change and to make decisions from them. Climate change is complex, and we need to be looking at more complex decision-making frameworks to help us to guide us in those directions. And what we also learned was that sometimes we learn the most when we actually get it wrong, and that it's not a case of failing, but we need to be prepared to step out, to test new ideas, and to learn if they fail. And if they succeed, well, then that's just great. And our Green Roof project showed us the benefit of having visible projects and accessible projects that people can see and touch and feel, and the value that that brings in terms of climate change communication and advocacy work. And so those learnings have really been important for us in developing our understanding of what adaptation means for our city and in crafting a way forward using some of those learnings. And the final approach that I'd just like to briefly speak to is Durban's always been a city that's willing to pioneer new things, often to get it wrong, but always to share the learnings and to be open about our experiences. And I'd just like to share with you one example where we're starting to work at the moment. One of our big challenges at the moment is to, as champions of this Durban Adaptation Charter, is to take the charter and its principles from being a piece of paper into practical implementation, because it's very easy to write up those 10 principles, but it's a completely different story to translate that into action. And we have, as a city, had some experience in implementing small-scale projects around some of those elements, but the challenge for us now is really to upscale and to be doing this work in big geographic areas, and that is completely new for us and quite daunting. And so what we've done as a starting point is to pull together a cross-sectoral municipal team, people from different departments within our municipality, to really try to work together towards a common climate adaptation vision within one of our river catchments. It's a large river catchment, so it's a big geographic space. It's quite a complex catchment. It has a huge diversity of socioeconomic conditions. It's quite a degraded catchment. And to get that team of people to set a vision, to set some objectives, and to work together towards achieving that. And so we've got members of the team who are implementing projects like wetland rehabilitation to attenuate stormwater, to attenuate flooding. We've got members of the team looking at issues like climate responsive town planning, issues around water quality, and so on. But what's been interesting is also in trying to manage that process is a lot of the softer issues that come in, issues around governance, issues around how you actually get people, a team like that, to work together towards a common goal. Things like monitoring and evaluating. How do you actually monitor whether you're being effective? And so the learnings from that we're finding we're hoping are going to help us not only in that catchment to effect large-scale adaptation, but that we can also take the learnings from the process and translate that and use it to effect larger-scale transformation in the city. And I'd just like to leave you with that quote, which I think is quite apt. And I think in view of how complex climate change is and the fact that there really is no single solution, opportunities to learn, to talk to each other, to reflect, become critically important in shaping productive and effective responses to climate change. Thanks very much.